Hello, we're going to talk about Tissue by Imtiaz Darka today. Another interesting poem, another modern poem. This one talks about the impermanence of ideas, how ideas do not last forever. It rejects fundamentalism. This poem is another important idea, and lots of powerful imagery, lots of ideas that we can compare with other poems. So let us read it first of all. Tissue. Paper that lets the light shine through. This is what could alter things. Paper thinned by age or touching. The kind you find in well-used books. The back of a Koran, where a hand has written in the names and histories. Who was born to whom. The height and weight. Who died, where and how, on which sepia date. Pages smoothed and stroked and turned transparent with attention. If buildings were paper, I might feel their drift, see how easily they fall away on a sigh, a shift in the direction of the wind. Maps, too. The sun shines through their borderlines, the marks that rivers make, roads, rail tracks, mountain folds. Fine slips from grocery shops that say how much was sold and what was paid by credit card might fly our lives like paper kites. An architect could use all this, place layer over layer, luminous script over numbers over line, and never wish to build again with brick or block, but let the daylight break through the capitals and monoliths, through the shapes that pride can make. Find a way to trace a grander design with living tissue, raise a structure never meant to last, of paper smoothed and stroked and thinned to be transparent, turned into your skin. So, lots to talk about there. I think one of the first things, of course, to address is the title. Now, if we talk about tissue, obviously the first thing we think of is very kind of thin substance, very soft, very breakable, almost you can see through it almost. And we also have to think about, similarly I think to remains, we have to think about the link to the human body. We think about the human tissue of muscle, of skin and bone, and what that says about us as people. So the first stanza, in fact, before we start talking about the language, just look at the size of the stanzas. They're all quatrains. There's a sort of a regular structure to this, just like paper, just like many of the structures that are mentioned in this poem. But they are short stanzas. They're very light, which becomes important. So quatrains there representing kind of the lightness while there is order in this poem. So paper that lets the light shine through. This is what could alter things. So we've got one sentence over 3 lines. Lots of enjambment in this poem across stanzas and across lines itself. And the light, as it says there, is symbolic here of God or Allah. Imtiaz Darka moved from Pakistan to Britain, to Scotland. So she is built up of many cultures herself. She describes herself as a Muslim Calvinist, so kind of conflicting ideas, but I think she would argue complementary ideas as well. And this is one of the things she's looking at here. How does the light in this poem represent God and represent other ideas? We certainly have a motif of light. And I want you to think as we go through this, what does it say about God? What does it say about truth? What does it say about ideas? And what does it say about hope? So it is, she's saying, it is the light that could alter things. Is this the power of ideas she's talking about? Is this the power of God that she's talking about? Paper thinned by age or touching. We have to think here about how ideas change over time. You see, I've written there, line 4 is about the evolution of ideas. Ideas that Darka says that are used over time. Again, I've written is the physicality, the use of these ideas. Ideas are nothing, are immaterial until we start using them. Paper is thinned by age or touching. It's a good idea, it's a good time, I think, to talk about the idea of palimpsest. Palimpsest, if you see I've written it here, specifically relating to line 26. But Darka was also an artist, and she worked in a very similar way to how this poem is constructed. A palimpsest is where someone would use a piece of parchment or whatever kind of paper. They would score it out and write over what they've already created. So you're writing something on top of something you've written in the past. This is how ideas can replace other ideas. So physically on the paper, on the parchment, it has been replaced by a new idea. And Darker is using that idea to represent how concepts and ideologies can change over time, how ideologies replace older ones. Not necessarily just an instant change, but an evolution, a gradual changing of ideas. So when we get into the next stanza, the kind you find in well-used books, the back of the Quran, where a hand is written in the names and histories who was born to whom. We think about these ideas being passed on through time. A hand is written in the names and histories. I mean, someone has literally written in the back of a Quran. I'm sure you know from our lessons the importance of the Quran and the Muslim faith. And these books, like Bibles, like many other texts, are sometimes passed down from generations to generation. People talk about having a family Bible. And in the back of those books, people have written here their names. This is how ideas can get passed on over time. And that is a positive thing in this stanza. Our ideas, when it links to family, when it links to connection, are a good thing. And we know that from line 5. The kind you find in well-used books. Of course, you there, very intimate pronoun. And books there, well-used books. You see in my annotations of well-used suggests it's been used a lot, perhaps slightly worn. But does the poet also mean intelligently used well? So that stanza, the second stanza, I think is very important for linking religion with family. Absolutely, that's important, because the ideas of this poem are not always a bad thing. I think when Darker later goes on to criticize fundamentalism, it's important that she has already stated that ideas are sometimes a good thing. They can connect families together, as we've already said. You'll see that line continues into the next stanza, into the third stanza. Who was born to whom? The height and weight. Who died where and how? On which sepia date? So what we have here is a strange kind of juxtaposition of solid facts with something a little less tangible. So on the one hand, we have a clear list of who was born to whom, their height, their weight, who died where and how. It's this family history that becomes intertwined with religion. Yet, the interesting image, I think, is in line 10 of sepia date. Now, you might not be familiar with sepia. In early photography, and in fact towards the end of the 20th century, you would still get this kind of photography. You have black and white photography, but you also have what's called a sepia tone, which is various kind of shades of brown, something to do with the chemicals and the processing of those images. And they would have a certain kind of nostalgic appearance about them. If you describe something as sepia, you're talking about nostalgia. And you'll see in my annotations, I question, is it real here? The images here, are they real? It's an almost halcyon. When we spoke about the last poem, we talked about how it's idealistic, how it's rose-tinted. And what we have here is perhaps a suggestion that the truth is lost somewhat to nostalgia. However, this is still kind of a very valued, very cared for book. In line 11, the pages are smoothed and stroked and turned, transparent with attention. Very, very tender, very intimate act. All those verbs there in line 11 are smoothed, stroked, turned. Very intimate, very gentle. And they really, really value the ideas in that book, and specifically the link that that book has to their family and their heritage. And they turned transparent with attention. What the line means on the face of it is they've touched the pages so frequently that they've worn them thin. But as you can see, my annotations for line 12, we're talking here about the changing nature of ideas. Perhaps it's an opportunity to start again while keeping tradition. Perhaps as ideas change, society changes with them, or ideas change to meet society. The importance of the thinness and the transparency of the pages is that these ideas are flexible, that they are not rigid, and they can bend as society changes. If we don't do that, perhaps Darker is saying, fundamentalism wins. And we start looking now, the poem begins to change into something a little bit more kind of serious, a little bit more solid. And yet we have an argument here in line 13. If buildings were paper, I might feel their drift, see how easily they fall away on a sigh. This poem was written in 2006. The title of the anthology was The Terrorist at My Table. We can't therefore ignore the image of 9/11. Of course, that happened in 2001, just 5 years before this. And if we're thinking about how easily buildings fall away, how easily buildings collapse, and the ideas of fundamentalists, we can't forget those images that were so widely spread of 9/11, of the World Trade Centers falling down. And what she's talking about here is about the power of ideas to unify, i.e. to bring people together, but also the power of ideas to destroy. Now, we're beginning to get an idea here, as you can see in my annotation there, an argument against man's arrogance. Perhaps we're looking at kind of the hubris of mankind. If we start thinking about Ozymandias, perhaps Darker was talking about these buildings as being a hubristic representation of man's futile attempts to build. And yet she says, if buildings were paper, I might feel their drift, see how easily they fall away on a sigh. A sigh, I think, is a very intangible thing again. Just an expression of breath, of air, and from that the building collapses. Perhaps she's saying that the ideas themselves are sighs, and that is an idea represented in line 16, a shift in a direction of the wind, she says, that might bring down a building. And it's the direction of the wind, perhaps that's ideas. And again, you'll see in my annotations, it says it's a warning there against the lust for permanence. Man is kind of desperate to have these things last forever. Look upon my works, ye mighty, and despair, Ozymandias says. And it's gone, everything around, nothing besides remains. And I think this is a very similar idea. A shift in the direction of the wind. Man is ultimately powerless against time and against nature. And Darker says, against ideas. Now, maps too, I think they're in a very interesting image that we've certainly discussed in London and in other poems as well. And it is an attempt to control, to classify things. Maps are, again, another sign of man's power. It is, you see my annotation there, it's a secular idea of control and tradition. Secular, of course, means not relating to religion. And that is one thing she's talking about. Well, that itself is an idea. If we extend that a little bit further, countries are ideas. Borders are just ideas that people have decided for convenience or for political reasons. They've decided that borders should exist. However, the sun shines through their borderlines. And there's a lot to talk about just in those few words. We've got the reoccurring motif of the sun, of light. And you see I've questioned there, is she talking about truth, love, God? What is she talking about? And it shines through their borderlines. Again, that there, that's so frequent in a lot of poems in this anthology. Their borderlines, who has decided on these borderlines? And borders, we know, are a source of conflict. They're there, people argue, I suppose, for protection, for security, but they are what causes conflict. Many, many wars have been fought and continue to be fought about the lines drawn on maps. The marks that rivers make, roads, rail tracks, mountain folds. This feels a little bit about man's attempt to control nature and the conflict that arises from that. There's a degree here, I think, of romanticism as a very romantic stanza, in the sense that it rejects man's control. It tries to link us to nature once more. The marks that rivers make. It's natural and man-made objects combining to define us. That is what creates the sense of control. Now, if we move on to the next stanza, we're looking again at types of paper, how paper can be used. This, I do think, is a very kind of real poem in many senses, in that it talks about family and reality and the everyday. Fine slips from grocery shops that say how much was sold and what was paid by credit card might fly our lives like paper kites. So again, we've got this sense of paper being very light, being very fine, and on it someone is writing something but solid, just like the names and the dates in the back of the Quran. But this is the everyday. It feels local, I've written, yet it's universal. The power of paper and ideas to bring us together, but also perhaps a source of conflicts. The idea of credit card, it feels automatically, as an image, as a piece of imagery, it feels negative, doesn't it? You're owing somebody something. And yet that is contrasted to the paper kites. It might fly our lives like paper kites. Of course, we think about kites as a kind of something that's very light, something that's very free. So moving on. An interesting idea to go back here to something more solid, back to the buildings, man's attempt to build things. Architect, obviously, someone whose job it is to design buildings. And what does that represent? Does it represent plans? Does it represent hopes? Really, there's some questions for us to ask there in this. But certainly it's about people designing something for the future. An architect could use all this, place layer over layer. And this is where the idea of the palimpsest comes back. It's an opportunity for new ideas. New idea on new idea on new idea. Luminous script over numbers over line. Again, the motif of light comes back. I never wish to build again with brick or block. And look at line 28 here. Never wish to build again with brick. It's a rejection of something permanent. This is what Darker was saying. How these solid ideas only get in the way of life and of happiness. Is a solidity that seems stubborn. And interestingly, we've got the enjambment now into the next stanza. I think brick and block, very kind of firm words. And it sounds like it's stubborn. It sounds like it's getting in the way of the flow of the poem, which is otherwise quite light, quite gentle, with brick or block. But let the daylight break through capitals and monoliths. Again, we've got the invasion of light here. The invasion of light through these solid things that man builds. She's talking about how they get in the way. A capital. We're talking about, yes, it's a homophone, it's a building, a large building, but also the cities, these huge things that we built. Monolith just means a huge single building. The statue in Ozymandias would be a monolith. A huge tower is a monolith. It's got connotations, I suppose, of something quite hubristic, something quite arrogant, a huge monument to something. And we talk about through capitals and monoliths, through the shapes that pride can make. The tremendous kind of idea there about continuing the theme here of man's arrogance and how it can get in the way. Find a way to trace a grand design. This grand design, I think, is about looking to the future, planning to the future. Planning for peace, I think. So she's going to find a way to trace a grand design with living tissue. Living tissue. We got back to the title. We spoke about how, yes, it means the material substance, but also the human form. Perhaps she's saying that it is mankind that is the answer. It is our ideas and our ability to work together that is the answer. Erase a structure never meant to last. She doesn't want these ideas to be strong and permanent and get in the way of each other and compete for attention. She wants ideas to be changing and evolving and flexible. Of paper smoothed and stroked and thinned to be transparent. Something gentle. Again, we've got these verbs that we had in the third stanza, these very intimate verbs. Talk about use, talk about family. So we've gone back from kind of the man's arrogance in building these huge monoliths and capitals. We've gone back to the ideas of family. And finally, this very kind of intimate line that hangs out there by itself, turned into your skin. We talk about the fragile nature of life, the ephemerality of life. It doesn't last forever. So there we go. That is Tissue, Imtiaz Darka. Just a few things to remember about this at the end. She, as a poet, is concerned, as it says there, about the intersection between the religious and the secular side of life. She's a traveller. She says this about herself. She's a traveller between cultures. And ultimately, for me, this is a poem about the rejection of fundamentalism. Something very important for you to remember there.